The moment Maribel stepped off the rattling stagecoach, the wind cut across the empty street like a sharpened blade, biting her cheeks and whipping her long sun-bleached hair into a tangled mess. She hugged her small bundle tightly against her chest, feeling the rough fabric of the blanket scratch her palms, and stared at the ghostly town before her. The wooden buildings loomed like hollowed-out teeth of some giant beast, their shutters clattering in the breeze. Not a soul moved. Not a sound came except the distant caw of a crow, slicing the silence with a harsh, jagged note. Her stomach twisted with unease. This wasn't the bustling frontier town she had been promised. This was a place that seemed abandoned, as if the desert itself had swallowed it whole, and then she saw him. He stood by the saloon's swinging doors, a tall silhouette etched against the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. His posture was loose but alert, every movement precise, almost predatory. Yet there was a strange grace to the way he shifted his weight from one boot to the other. Long black hair tumbled past his broad shoulders, catching the wind like a banner of night. The shadows played across his chiseled features, making his skin look both dark and luminous, the color of sun-baked earth. His eyes, sharp and gleaming, locked onto hers, and Maribel felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Somehow, even across the dusty street, he seemed to see not just her body but the tremor of fear in her chest, the tight coil of anxiety she had carried since childhood. She swallowed hard, afraid to move, afraid to flee, yet unable to tear her gaze away. Her past had taught her that strangers brought danger, but there was something in him, a stillness, a certainty that unsettled her in a different way. The air between them seemed to thrum with tension, thick as the heat rising off the cracked wooden sidewalks. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a wild stallion trying to escape its pen. Maribel's voice came out in a small, shaky whisper. Are you alone?" The man's lips twitched, almost forming a smile, though his eyes never wavered. "I am," he replied, his voice low, resonant, carrying a weight she couldn't place. "And you are far from anyone who could help you." Fear prickled her skin, sharp as the barbed wire fences that lined the outskirts of towns like this one, yet beneath it was an odd current of relief. Maybe, just maybe, he was different from the kind of man who preyed on young women alone in the West. She noticed the leather, straps on his forearms, the faint scent of sage and smoke clinging to his coat, the subtle strength in the lines of his arms. He radiated danger, yes, but it was tempered with discipline, like a horse that had been broken yet still retained its wildness. I'm Maribel," she stammered, tugging at the edge of her bundle as if it could shield her from whatever lay ahead. I was told I could find work here. My uncle said." Her words trailed off, swallowed by the sudden rush of wind that sent dust and small stones skittering across the wooden boards of Main Street. He took a single step toward her, and Maribel instinctively took one back. Then another step, and another, slow, deliberate, non-threatening. He stopped a few feet away, far enough to give her space but close enough to fill her senses with the scent of leather, smoke, and something wild, untamed, primal. His eyes softened just a fraction, and he said words she would never forget. "I won't hurt you." The simplicity of the promise sent a thrill through her veins. Every muscle in her body, tensed and ready to flee, relaxed just slightly. Yet her mind screamed caution. Promises meant little in a land where law was often nothing more than a whisper, and survival depended on cunning, not trust. Maribel glanced at the saloon behind him, its doors swaying lazily, shadows dancing across the dust-streaked windows. The wind howled again, and she felt, for the first time in years, the weight of loneliness pressing down on her chest. And in that moment, staring into the warrior's eyes, she understood one thing with perfect clarity. This man, this shadow of the desert, would change everything or he might destroy her. The desert sun blazed overhead, relentless, scorching the earth. Maribel shivered, despite the heat, as the warrior stepped fully into the light, revealing broad shoulders, arms that hinted at strength honed by survival, and eyes that promised protection or vengeance. Her pulse raced. Every instinct screamed danger, yet every fiber of her being whispered hope. And so, with a deep breath, she took her first step toward the man who had appeared like a phantom from the heart of the West, unaware that this encounter would shape the rest of her life. Maribel's footsteps echoed against the wooden boards of Main Street, each creak amplifying the uncertainty curling in her chest. She had moved through frontier towns before, but none had ever felt so empty, so fragile, as if a single gust of wind could blow the whole place into oblivion. She adjusted the bundle in her arms, the cloth stiff with dust, and took a tentative step closer to Ta. He didn't flinch or scowl. Instead, his dark eyes followed her, calm, unwavering, the faintest crease of curiosity brushing his brow. He was larger than any man she had seen, muscles rippling under sun-darkened skin, shoulders broad enough to shield her from the world. And yet, despite the strength that radiated from him, there was a softness in the way he watched her, as if he could sense the fragility beneath her careful composure. I wasn't expecting anyone," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the creaking wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. Her throat tightened. "Most people. They leave you behind." Ta's lips pressed into a thin line, then slowly curved into something like understanding. "People leave," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of experience. "But some stay. Some fight to protect what matters." He took a deliberate step closer, but not too close. The space between them was measured, respectful, yet charged with a silent promise. Maribel wanted to believe him. She wanted to let go of the gnawing fear she carried from years of hardship, from growing up in the shadow of untrustworthy men and cold orphanage walls. But her heart hesitated, a wary bird fluttering against the cage of her ribs. She swallowed and forced herself to meet his gaze. "And you? What do you fight for?" she asked. TAWE single quotes, his eyes darkened as he looked past her, toward the horizon where the desert met the burning sky. "For honor. For those who cannot defend themselves. For the promise that I will never harm someone who has not harmed me." He turned his gaze back to her, unwavering, and added softly, "Especially you." The words made Maribel's breath catch. She had lived her life under the assumption that kindness was a rarity, that loyalty was as fleeting as the wind in the canyon. Yet here was a man, silent and commanding, offering both without expectation. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Somehow, his presence filled the emptiness of the town, replacing the desolation with a fragile sense of hope. "I don't know if I can trust anyone," she admitted, her voice trembling as the wind tugged at her hair. "Not after everything I've been through." Ta's eyes softened further, though his body remained a taut line of controlled power. "Trust isn't given," he said. "It's earned. And I will earn yours, even if it takes everything I have." She felt a flicker of warmth spread through her chest, a sensation foreign and frightening, like the first light of dawn creeping across the desert floor. For the first time in a long while, she considered that maybe she didn't have to face the West alone. A sudden clatter of hooves in the distance made both of them turn. Dust spiraled along the street as a lone rider appeared, carrying a bundle of letters tied to his saddle. Maribel's stomach clenched. Bandits had been seen near the outskirts of town, and the sight of a rider any rider set her nerves on edge. Ta moved instinctively, stepping slightly in front of her, his stance protective, his fingers brushing the hilt of a knife at his waist. "They don't belong here," he muttered, more to himself than to her, eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "Stay behind me." Maribel's throat went dry, her hands tightening around the bundle. She wanted to retreat, to run back to the stagecoach, but the presence of Ta gave her courage. Something in the set of his jaw, in the steady rhythm of his breath, told her that he would not falter, that he would face whatever danger came their way. Without hesitation, as the rider drew closer, Maribel realized that trust, fragile though it was, had begun to take root. It was a strange, disquieting feeling, like stepping barefoot into cold creek water, the shock of sensation, the danger of slipping, yet the undeniable clarity of being alive. For the first time in years, Maribel allowed herself to hope. She didn't yet know the battles that awaited them, the storms, both literal and emotional, that would test their fragile bond. But she knew one thing with certainty. In Ta, she had found not just a protector, but a companion who, whether she was ready or not, would walk beside her through the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Old West. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to survive. Night descended over the town like a velvet curtain, thick and suffocating, swallowing the wooden buildings in shadow. The wind carried a biting chill, rattling shutters and tugging at Maribel's hair. She huddled in the stables behind the general store, the rough wood pressing into her back as she hugged her knees, trying to make herself small, invisible. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant howl of a coyote sent her pulse racing. The desert outside was alive with unseen threats, and she felt the familiar gnaw of fear clawing at her chest. Ta stood outside, a sentinel in the moonlight. Even from inside the stable, Maribel could see the taut muscles of his arms and shoulders under the dim silver glow. He shifted slowly, deliberately, scanning the outskirts of the town with hawk-like precision. His long black hair moved with the wind, and the tribal jewelry at his neck and wrists caught faint glimmers of light, sparkling like tiny flames in the night. He was calm, a grounded force amid the chaos, yet every line of his body screamed readiness. He was ready to strike at the slightest sign of danger, and Maribel knew instinctively that he would. Her gaze flitted to the shadows beyond the stable doors. Stories of bandits hiding near the river had reached her ears earlier in the day, whispered by the few travelers and townsfolk brave enough to speak. The thought of them lurking in the darkness, waiting to ambush anyone unfortunate enough to wander outside, made her stomach twist. Her hands clenched the bundle tighter. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she knew there was nowhere to run. Not alone. Not in a town emptied of allies. A sudden rustle of wind-blown debris made her jump, and she held her breath. She could see Ta's silhouette tense, his stance widening as if he were about to leap into action. Her heart lurched. He was always so close yet so untouchable, like a shadow that existed to guard, not to comfort. She felt a pang of longing to be near him, to reach out, but fear anchored her in place. "Maribel," he said, his voice low, carrying through the chill night air. She froze, her name on his lips like a lifeline. "Stay down. Keep still. No sudden movements." "Yes," she whispered, nodding, though he couldn't see her. Her throat was dry, her chest tight, but there was a strange comfort in hearing him speak. Even through the tension, she sensed a thread of care woven into every word. Minutes passed like hours. The wind carried whispers of the desert distant howls, the rustle of mesquite branches, the faint scrape of something metallic against wood. Maribel's imagination painted them as figures cloaked in menace, shadowy bandits with guns and knives, hungry for anything they could take. She clenched her fists, wishing she could be braver, wishing she could stand alongside Ta instead of trembling behind him. Then, a sudden movement, a figure approaching across the moonlit street, made her gasp. Ta reacted instantly, stepping from the shadows like a predator, his bare chest gleaming in silver light, muscles coiled for action. He positioned himself between her and the approaching figure, eyes narrowing with deadly precision. Even the moonlight seemed to highlight the edges of his frame, casting him as both shield and weapon. "Who goes there?" he called, his voice a low growl that carried authority, warning, and the promise of swift retribution all at once. The figure stopped, hesitated, and then a horse whinnied in the distance, the sound sharp against the still night. Maribel pressed herself against the wall, breath shallow. She had never felt so exposed and so safe at the same time, safe because he was there, powerful and unwavering. Exposed because the danger was so close, so real, and there was nothing she could do to protect herself. The figure slowly revealed itself, a lone rider, hunched over, carrying something tied to his saddle. Relief and tension collided inside her. Not bandits, not yet, but still, a messenger in the dead of night could be dangerous. Ta's eyes followed the rider, calculating, alert, every muscle ready for instant action. Maribel's hand shook, but for the first time that night she dared to breathe. In the shadowed town, with the wind moaning through the empty streets, she realized something undeniable. Survival in this harsh, unforgiving landscape would require more than skill or luck. It would require trust. And she would have to trust Ta, even when every instinct screamed caution, even when fear threatened to undo her. For tonight, at least, she was not alone. And for the first time in years, that small realization offered a fragile but potent spark of hope. The morning sun spilled over the horizon in molten streaks of gold and crimson, painting the desert sky in brilliant, unforgiving colors. Maribel had woken early, her body stiff and sore from the night spent huddled in the stable. She ventured toward the creek that ran just beyond the outskirts of town, hoping to fetch water and wash away the dust that clung to her skin. Her foot caught on a jagged rock hidden beneath the scrub, and she tumbled forward with a sharp gasp, pain shooting through her ankle. "Oh!" she cried, pressing a hand to the throbbing joint. She tasted the copper tang of blood as she tried to stand, only to collapse again onto the warm sand. The world tilted in a dizzying blur of light and shadow. Panic surged through her chest. Alone, she realized she would never survive this harsh land. A shadow fell across her, massive and comforting all at once. Ta's presence was immediate. He moved with the quiet precision of a predator, but his hands were gentle as he lifted her into his arms. The warmth of his skin was like sunlight, searing and protective, and for a moment, she clutched him instinctively, seeking both safety and comfort. "Go slow," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It hurts." "I will," he said, his deep voice steady, unwavering. "I'll die before I hurt you." The words were a promise she wanted to believe, and somehow she did. The pain in her ankle faded slightly in the presence of his assurance, replaced by the strange, tentative thrill of trust. He carried her carefully across the creek, placing her on a flat rock shaded by a twisted mesquite tree. The water gurgled nearby, shimmering gold in the sunlight, and Maribel was struck by the beauty of the desert, harsh and unforgiving, yet breathtakingly alive. He crouched beside her, producing a clean cloth from his satchel, dampening it in the creek water and pressing it gently against the swelling ankle. "Breathe," he murmured, his fingers brushing against her skin as he worked. "Focus on the water, on the sun, on the wind. Don't let the pain control you." Maribel swallowed hard, feeling the shock of his closeness, the strength in his hands, the warmth in his gaze. Her heart raced, a confusing mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else, something tender, almost foreign. He wasn't just a protector. He was the first person in years who had offered her care without question or expectation. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked softly, barely above a whisper. Ta's eyes held hers for a long, weighty moment. "Because it is right. Because you deserve it. Because no one should suffer alone in this world. Maribel." He brushed a lock of her hair from her face, the touch feather-light yet burning against her skin. "And because I promised you no harm will come from me." The desert stretched around them, golden sands and distant mesas shimmering in the heat. A pair of crows wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the hush of the morning. Maribel felt herself exhale, the tension that had gripped her chest for so long loosening, if only slightly. She dared to hope that perhaps, for the first time, someone was standing by her side, not just a shadow, not just a protector, but someone who understood, someone who cared. Taw he continued to tend to her ankle, his movements precise, deliberate, each touch measured to avoid causing further pain. The warmth of his skin, the quiet hum of his voice, and the soft rustle of the wind through the mesquite leaves formed a cocoon around her, shielding her from the harshness of the desert. She realized with a mixture of awe and trepidation that she had begun to trust him, truly trust him, despite the fear that lingered in her veins. Hours passed as he worked, the sun climbing higher, the creek water sparkling like liquid gold. Maribel felt the swelling in her ankle begin to subside, the sharp sting dulling to a manageable ache. And in that quiet, sun-drenched moment, she made a choice. Though the desert was cruel, though danger lurked beyond the horizon, she would allow herself to lean on Taw, to let him be the shield against the world's cruelty, even if only for a while. For the first time in years, Maribel felt the fragile warmth of hope stir within her, a promise of survival, trust, and perhaps, if fate allowed, something far deeper. And Taw, silent and unwavering, had become the keeper of that fragile flame. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple, clouds rolling in from the west like an unstoppable tide. The wind rose sharply, rattling the empty shutters of the town and carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the charged tension of a coming storm. Maribel tightened her shawl around her shoulders, the fabric doing little to ward off the chill, and pressed herself against the side of the general store. The dust swirled in dizzying spirals across the cracked dirt street, stinging her eyes and leaving grit in her mouth. Taw stood nearby, his silhouette framed by the looming clouds. Even in the dim light, she could see the taut lines of his body, the muscles of his chest and arms coiled like springs, ready for any danger that might approach. His long black hair whipped around his face, and the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists caught the intermittent flickers of sunlight that filtered through the clouds. Every inch of him radiated vigilance, and Maribel felt both safe and insignificant under the weight of his gaze. "Maribel," he said softly, his voice cutting through the wind like a knife, "stay close. The storm will be fierce, and we must find shelter before it strikes." She nodded, unable to speak, her thoughts whirling like the clouds above. The day had started with hope, the creek and the morning sun offering a fragile sense of safety. Now the air felt heavy with foreboding. She followed him as he led her toward a small cabin on the edge of town, its wooden walls warped and aged, but at least offering protection from the elements. Inside, the cabin was dark, smelling of dust, wood, and the faint tang of old smoke. Taw guided her to a corner, placing her carefully on an upturned crate so she could sit. He moved around the cabin with the precision of a seasoned hunter, closing shutters, securing doors, and stacking heavy objects against the weak frames. Maribel watched in awe. Every gesture was measured, deliberate, yet fluid, a dance of strength and skill that reassured her despite the storm looming outside. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, hammering the roof like 1,000 tiny drums. Thunder rolled across the distant mesas, shaking the walls and making Maribel flinch. She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by both fear and the raw power of the natural world. She could feel her pulse hammering against her temples, every instinct screaming to flee, yet there was nowhere to run. Taw knelt beside her, his large hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Look at me," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "The storm is outside. You are safe here with me. Nothing will touch you." She dared a glance up, meeting his gaze. There was no pretense in his expression, No false bravado, only the quiet certainty of someone who had faced the harshest elements and emerged unbroken. The knowledge that he was willing to stand between her and any danger, human or natural, sent a tremor of gratitude and trust through her. Hours passed with the storm raging outside, the rain pounding relentlessly, the wind shrieking through the gaps in the cabin walls. Ta kept near her, moving silently, checking the weak spots of the structure, ensuring that she remained protected. Each small gesture, the way he handed her a dry cloth, the careful adjustment of a blanket over her shoulders, spoke volumes of his devotion. In the flickering light of a lantern, Maribel allowed herself to relax slightly, leaning back against the rough wood with her eyes half closed. She had survived the creek, the lonely streets, and now the storm, and she had survived because Ta had been there. A fragile thread of hope, of trust, of connection had begun to weave itself between them. She realized that survival in the West was never just about skill or strength. It was about alliances, about trust, and about those rare souls willing to stand unwaveringly by your side. The storm continued through the night, but inside the cabin, Maribel felt a small, steady warmth. She dared to hope, if only for a moment, that with Ta by her side, she could endure whatever the desert and its dangers might throw at them next. The storm had passed, leaving the town glistening under the early morning sun, every surface sparkling with beads of rain. Maribel stepped cautiously onto the cracked wooden boards, her ankles still tender but wrapped securely by Ta's careful hands. The desert beyond the town stretched in golden waves, dotted with mesas and mesquite trees, the air sharp with the scent of wet sand and sage. She could hear the faint call of a hawk overhead, the world waking after the violent night. He stood nearby, his broad chest exposed to the warming sun, tribal jewelry catching the light with each subtle movement. Muscles rippled under his sun-darkened skin as he scanned the horizon, every gesture precise and deliberate. Even in the calm after the storm, he radiated vigilance. Maribel felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and the tiniest hint of fear-tinged awe. He was larger than life, a living force of strength and protection. Yet she sensed a softness beneath the armor of his presence, a quiet respect for her vulnerability. "I think the worst of it has passed," Ta said, his voice low, carrying a weight of experience and reassurance. He offered his hand to her. "Come, walk with me?" Maribel hesitated, her ankle aching slightly with each step. But she reached for his hand, and the warmth of his grip bolstered her courage. As they walked together through the deserted streets, she realized how much she had come to rely on his steady presence. Every motion was deliberate, protective, every glance reassuring. The world felt dangerous, yet with him by her side, she felt a fragile sense of safety she hadn't known in years. They reached the outskirts of town, where the desert stretched endlessly, the wind carrying whispers of unseen threats and distant wildlife. Ta led her along a narrow trail lined with scrub and wildflowers, their colors vibrant after the rain. The ground was soft from the storm, and Maribel felt the cool, damp earth beneath her boots. Her fingers brushed against his as they walked, and a strange heat rushed through her. "You move well," he said, his voice carrying amusement, though his eyes never left the horizon. "Stronger than I expected." Maribel laughed softly, a sound that felt strange to her own ears. "I've had to survive," she said. "Alone most of the time." Ta's gaze softened, the steel in his eyes replaced by understanding. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said. "Not if you don't want to be." The words were simple, yet they struck her with unexpected force. She had spent so long guarding herself, building walls to survive, that the notion of trust, real, unbroken trust, felt almost impossible. Yet standing here, under the endless sky, with him beside her, the walls felt weaker. More porous. Hours passed as they continued their cautious journey through the desert. They shared quiet words, laughter, and moments of silence that felt as meaningful as conversation. Maribel began to understand the depth of Ta's honor, the careful way he moved, the way he watched over her, the unspoken promise that no harm would ever come from him. And in turn, he seemed to notice her strength as well, the resilience in her steps, the courage behind her wary eyes, the spark of determination she refused to hide. As the sun began to dip toward the western mesas, painting the sky in molten reds and fiery oranges, Maribel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I trust you." Ta's hand paused mid-motion, his eyes locking onto hers with a gravity that made her stomach tighten. Then he placed his hand gently over hers, the warmth radiating through her. "And I will never betray that trust," he vowed, his voice steady, unwavering. The promise lingered in the air between them, heavier than any storm that had passed. In that barren, brutal landscape, the connection between them ignited, fragile yet undeniable. Survival in the West had always been about strength, skill, and cunning. But here, standing together against the vast, unforgiving desert, Maribel realized that trust, loyalty, and shared courage were the forces that mattered most. And as the sun bled across the horizon, she understood that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer alone. The sun dipped low, casting the desert in molten gold and crimson shadows, as Maribel and Ta reached the crest of a small rise overlooking the town. The wind carried a faint scent of sage and wet earth, remnants of the storm that had tested them the night before. Maribel's ankle throbbed slightly with every step, but the pain was overshadowed by the strange, grounding calm she felt with Ta beside her. He stopped and turned to face her, his broad chest illuminated by the fading sunlight, muscles taut yet relaxed, eyes dark and unreadable yet full of promise. The tribal jewelry at his neck and wrists caught the light, glinting like fire in the desert wind. His long black hair fluttered around his shoulders, framing a face carved from determination and honor. For a moment, time seemed to halt the desert, the town, even the sun itself fading into stillness around them. "You've come far," Ta said softly, his voice carrying both admiration and reassurance. "Stronger than I expected." Maribel swallowed hard, her heart racing, emotions tangled like the wind-blown dust at their feet. I had someone guiding me," she admitted, voice trembling. "Someone who wouldn't let me fall." Her eyes met his, and she saw something in his gaze that made the desert itself seem less harsh, less lonely, a quiet, unyielding protection, a promise etched in strength. He took a step closer, the sun glinting off his tribal jewelry. "I vowed long ago," he said, voice low and steady, "that I would die before I hurt you. And I mean that with every breath, every heartbeat." His hand reached for hers, strong yet gentle, fingers brushing against hers in a touch that was both grounding and electrifying. Maribel's chest tightened, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something deeper she had not allowed herself to name. She had survived the desert, the storm, the lonely streets, and countless dangers, but it was this man, this warrior, who had changed everything. He had become more than a protector. He had become the anchor in her life, the steady presence that made the impossible seem possible. "I trust you," she whispered, the words trembling but sincere. "Completely." Ta's eyes softened and a rare, small smile brushed his lips. "And I will never betray that trust," he vowed again, each word a weighty promise. He knelt briefly to meet her gaze at eye level, his hand still holding hers, a bond unspoken yet profound. The desert around them seemed to pause in reverence, the wind quiet, the distant town holding its breath as if witnessing the forging of something sacred. Maribel felt warmth spread through her chest, a sensation she had not experienced in years. The fear, the uncertainty, The loneliness, all of it had led to this moment, to a fragile yet undeniable connection. She realized that survival in the West was not only about skill, strength, or luck. It was about trust, loyalty, and the rare souls willing to stand unwaveringly by one another. And Ta had proven himself, time and again, to be that soul. The sky above shifted to deep purple, sprinkled with the first stars of evening. Shadows stretched long across the desert, yet in that golden twilight, Maribel felt safe. She could sense the strength radiating from him, a living shield against the harshness of the world. And she knew that, no matter what trials awaited, they would face them together. Ta released her hand slowly, stepping back but keeping his eyes locked on hers. "We'll face the desert, the storms, and whatever else comes our way," he said, voice resolute. "But we'll do it together. You and I." Maribel nodded, the weight of her past lifting slightly with each heartbeat. "Together," she echoed, a small smile touching her lips despite the dust and exhaustion of their journey. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of partnership in a world that had once seemed cruel and indifferent as the last rays of sunlight painted the mesas in crimson and gold. The two stood side by side, silhouettes against the vast, untamed desert. The wind whispered through the sage and mesquite, carrying away fear and doubt, leaving only trust, courage, and an unspoken vow. And in that endless, unforgiving landscape, Maribel knew with certainty that she was no longer alone. Not ever again. Together, they would endure. Together, they would survive. Together, they would live.